Good morning and afternoon, everyone, wherever you're joining from. I'm Marie Sokolo. I'm part of the corporate philanthropy team at Bloomberg, and we're delighted to have such a broad and diverse audience from across the nonprofit sector participating in this session. So today we'll focus on a spotlight on data strategy. Earlier this afternoon, you heard from some of our leaders and innovative nonprofit speakers on how they use data science and their human capital to solve some of the problems that lie at the core of our UK society. We strongly believe that there is also a role for us as businesses and nonprofit organizations to play. Through knowledge sharing, innovative solutions can be scaled to achieve even higher impact goals. Today, we will start on our digital data journey by hearing from Hippolyte Ribin of Bloomberg and Kevin Blumson of J.P. Morgan, who will tell us more about data strategy and ways nonprofit organizations such as yours, no matter your size and how versed you are in data science, can govern, analyze, and deploy data assets to best support your objectives. Please do send any questions you may have along the presentation in the Q&A chat box, and we will use some of the time at the end of the session to answer as many questions as possible. That being said, I will now hand it over to Hippolyte and Kevin. So the floor is now all yours.
Thank you, Mary. So hello and welcome to this presentation. If we could go to the next slide, please. The agenda for today. So first, we are going to talk about why data strategy is important. It's the topic of today, so obviously. What is data is also a crucial aspect of data strategy. We need to define what data is to be able to make a pertinent strategy on it. And then we need to focus on what data is personal. I'm sure you've all heard about GDPR. This is a very sensitive topic at the moment, and personal data raises some concern about privacy and data handling that we need to cover. And then we are going to go through an example to see what can be done on a more case-by-case basis. This session is intended as a high-level overview. We will not cover everything of setting up a data strategy from A to Z, but we will refer you to some other session that will happen throughout the week during this event so that you may have further resource to draw upon. I will now give the place to Kevin, who will continue this presentation.
Wonderful, thank you, Hippolyte. If we can have the next slide, please. So it's a pleasure to be here talking to you all today. Unfortunately, due to the situation, I cannot see everybody, but I hope everyone is engaged and enthused about this topic as we are. Unfortunately, again, because of the circumstances, we won't have the same ability to network and carry on these discussions after the event in the traditional way. But, hopefully this will get you thinking, and to whatever extent possible, we'll be able to continue this dialogue virtually. So to get straight into the material, because we do have quite a lot to cover, we'll be getting through this quite quickly. Just before we get into the content that's on screen, just a little bit about my personal data journey, because ultimately we're all on the same digital data journey, right? We're at different stages in our evolution, at different places on that journey, but we're all fundamentally on the same journey. In my career, which has been exclusively in financial services over more than 20 years, I've been at organizations where data was being created by a black pen and a red pen in a physical book, where there was a culture that, people weren't necessarily trusting the intelligence that was coming out of the data. The data was delivered through, physical printouts from dot matrix printers and handed on sheets of paper. And all of this, has changed a lot over time, to the point where, at one point in my career, we're presenting some output of some data analysis to senior management, who responded with a line that has stuck with me, that we're now pregnant with this information. The power of that information to enable organizations to make decisions was, I think, a really powerful statement when people could start to trust their data. So where are we in terms of this slide? The way we're going to present this presentation is we're going to be using a hypothetical organization, teach the children, which Hippolyte will introduce later. And we're going to use that as a worked example. Like a good Hollywood movie, we're going to start from the end and then kind of go back 24 hours earlier. So what you're seeing on screen is the output of that data journey for this particular organization. We're dealing with a charity that, in this hypothetical scenario, has their data strategy sorted, has their data information available, and people are able to work with it. And what this organization has done in this hypothetical scenario, they have modeled how fundraising has changed as a result of the pandemic. So the charity has gone to online data donations, and they've created this pretty visualization to show the geographical spread of where their donations are coming from, having moved to a digital fundraising model. What they've done is, using aggregated and de-identified information, created a heat map by geolocation point to a level of specificity at a relatively small level, a zip code, a postcode, a sort of a geographical area. And what that has highlighted is that we've got some dense populations coming out of the Americas with people sharing their content. We've got dense populations in Western Europe, but we have sparse populations in Afghanistan, down to a very local area. Now, what this is demonstrating is an unintended consequence, right? So we've gone through our data strategy, we've enabled this information, we've given people the tools, we've created this nice visualization, we're maturing our data journey. But actually, what the unintended consequence is this charity Teach the Children, works with the military academies to help teach children confidence and, self-worth skills. And a number of the donors are therefore serving army members. And what this unintended consequence is where those people are making donations whilst on tour, which may be against, army policies, that's not our concern. What we've done through this example is highlight the location of foreign troops abroad, domestic troops in foreign territory, which, again, this is an unintended consequence, and it's just intended to highlight some of the things you need to consider when you're setting your data strategy in terms of where you want to be and some of the risks that you need to consider and manage as you go along that journey. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Why is data strategy important? So data in its natural state can be disorganized, it can be unsecured, and it can make your journey of creating illuminating information difficult, and it may introduce risk as well. So your data strategy can help you as you set out on your journey to making your data ecosystem more navigatable, more usable, and also to manage the risks and to protect it along the way. So when we think about things that are represented here, do you, organize your data that could be spread across multiple different Excel files on laptops of members of your organization? Is that data represented in a data model? Do we call the same thing the same way? The B date or the DOB is the date of birth. Do we have a universal understanding of what our data is? Do we know what's the original copy or the original version of truth versus a copy? So all of this information that we have potentially to tap into, unless we organize it and put a strategy around it, could be very difficult to work with and, could carry risks with working with it. We can go to the next slide, please. So we'll be testing our technology today with a little pop quiz. What you have on screen is an example scenario. Some information has come into this organization via email. The email is in French. Somebody at the organization has then put it through a website translation service, taken the subsequent information and put it into the database. So if we could have the new poll up, please. I believe it's number 4 in the sequence. What I would like to do is if we could get you just to using the thing that's hopefully popped up on your screen, select the answers that you believe apply to the question of what is data in this scenario. We'll just give you a moment and we'll see. Right. Can we see the results of those polls? Okay. So what this is showing is, and there was a slight, design flaw in the question, but what are people naturally thinking is the data here? In reality, it's all data. So the message, subject and body is clearly saying information that's been collected. There's the information, the headers, there's the stuff you didn't intend to collect, the metadata, the IP address. It's still part of the data packet, whether you intended to collect it or not. When you put that data through a translation website, and you need to think about your cultural norms here, many of us have grown up now with the translation website being there permanently, this sort of innocuous thing in our lives. There's a third party behind that, and you're actually accepting their terms and sharing that data with them when you post it. That could be, depending on what your organization does, that could be sensitive information, which is now with another third party when you don't know what their security protocols are with respect to storing that data. And then finally, we put that data in the database itself. In this example, we've actually inferred some information about the gender of the person as well, based on their name that we've recorded in that database. But like I say, it's a bit of a trick question because it's technically all that apply and that wasn't available, but it's to see where your natural leaning is towards. And people are correctly highlighting the message, subject, and body. But all of this stuff could be things that your data strategy needs to consider. We could have the next slide, please. And Hippolyte, I will hand back over to you for this one.
Thank you, Kevin. So, as we've seen just before, we need to define what is data, but more importantly, what is data to you, in the sense that in your organization, you are going to interact with data and you need to set up a definition that is clearly understood by everyone in your organization of what is data and what type of protocol should apply to which type of data. The email we've seen is an unstructured data, but sender and recipient, the location, IP address, when they sent it, where they sent it from, when was it read, all of this is metadata, all of this is information about the information that is very crucial and that needs to be carefully managed. Another example that is, I think, perhaps closer to what you can be touched is if you have a picture on your computer, you can see that the picture has been created at some point and you can see when it was created, when it was modified, when it was accessed last. You can even on some systems see who it was accessed by. And if your camera that you've taken the picture with has a GPS, you might be able to see where was the picture taken. And all of this is sitting inside the file without your knowledge and sometimes without you realizing that you might be exposing yourself to some danger with this data, because a photo in itself isn't very problematic. But as we've seen with the example that Kevin showed in his first slide, if the picture was taken in Afghanistan by some troops deployed abroad, the geolocation tag might be very, very important information that you do not want to share. So we need to define this data clearly. The problem is we need to define it in such a way that it's not too broad, because otherwise you might catch everything as data and everything as extremely sensitive information, and then you would have the trouble of creating too much bureaucracy, too much overhead over the data. In the opposite end of the spectrum, if you do not define it clearly enough, then people in your organization might be inconsistent in the way that they handle the data. Everyone needs to have a clear understanding of what the data is and what type of data should be handled in what way. A great tip for that is to have someone that is available to answer any question. I know that I started at Bloomberg 2 years ago, and I had a ton of questions about what type of data could I share, what type of data could I share with client, what type of data could I share with my colleague, and having someone that could answer all of these questions, and someone in your company that is dedicated, that knows this answer, or if they don't know the answer, can search and can then publish the answer, is I think, a crucial thing to have. If we could go to the next slide, please. So we've talked about data and personal data, but what is actually personal data? What data is considered personal? It's actually quite broad, because any data that can be used to identify you or to identify someone else is considered personal. But moreover, any data that can be combined with another piece of data is considered personal information. So for instance, if we have the date of birth, there is a very high likelihood that you're not the only person on Earth being born on that day. However, if we combine that with the city you were born in, maybe the hospital you were born in, maybe your size, maybe your hair color or your eye color, then we can start to narrow it down. And if we think about a very common example, such as Facebook, it is very possible to identify someone without his name just with all of this other information. Some information, some personal information is even more crucial, and it's known as sensitive personal information. So this contains, for instance, sexual orientation or biometric data, such as your fingerprint or even your retinal scan, or your DNA that is being handled in some kits that we've now seen online. This is something that is maybe not very known, but a lot of the human DNA is actually copyrighted nowadays. And so this is all sensitive information when you give your data and when people take it, and you need to take great care of it. If we could go to the next slide, please. Kevin.
Yes, thank you, Hippolyte. So another pop quiz just to keep people engaged, make sure we're all paying attention. Pretty simple one. So what is your data strategy orientation? Are you trying to enable people in your organization to use data and to unlock new insights and value? Or do you want your data strategy to help your organization protect its data? So when people are using it, they can use it without risk. So if we could have the poll up, that would be poll 2, please. And here we go. So again, just A or B. And just whilst people are taking a moment to answer that, why is this important, right? So we've spoken about the context. What is data? It's important to understand, as Hippolyte mentioned, it could be everything everywhere. And it's very important when setting your data strategy that you understand that context of where you are aiming or intending to apply this data strategy to. And that also helps say your orientation and understand your orientation in terms of what you want your data strategy to achieve. So if we could see the results and see how people have answered. Okay, mostly in favor of A, enabling data in your organization. Good. So if we could move to the next slide, please. Again, a slightly trick question in that, are these two orientations mutually exclusive? No, they're not. But the reality is, again, that it's difficult to do everything all of the time. So you're more likely to have a particular orientation that is either more, more offensive or more defensive. In reality, you will have elements of both. It's not, likely to be a 50-50 split. But what does that mean in terms of your actual data strategy? So when you think about what questions you are trying to help answer within your organization through your data strategy, you can have the same question that is answered slightly differently depending on your orientation. So if you're trying to help your people in your organization understand what data can I use, again, if you're focused on enabling, you might be looking at a strategy that is producing catalogs to make available and at least signpost people in your organization to where they need to go to get that data. Whereas if we have a more defensive position through our data strategy, we're trying to enable our people to know if that data that they can have is legal. What data can I use legally? What applies? And this may be addressed through policies. Then the question of what data should I use? So, the first question is, can I use it? Is it available? Do we have it? Is it legal? Do the policies say I can? Next question, should I use it? Again, if we are having a more offensive strategy, we're looking at the provenance of that data. Is that data fit for purpose? Is it of good quality? By the same vein, we can answer the same question in a more defensive position. Is my use appropriate? And I think what's very relevant here is the space between law and public opinion. And with advancements in technology and capabilities, we're evolving what we can do with data, but we also have to be very cognizant of what people expect us to do with their data, even when it's not subject to law or regulation. And so, a good example is that we can do both. We can make data accessible, we can put it in catalogs, but we can also provide the guardrails that enable your data entrepreneurs to have boundaries. So, what is appropriate in your organization based on where you want to position yourselves in the court of public opinion, right? So there's not necessarily going to be an objective external measure of that, but through your data strategy, you could make available, here's my catalog, here's my quality, and here's my mechanisms or processes or guardrails that go around it to help balance that out. If we could have the next slide, please. So I think, maybe what we've started to illuminate is some of the, things to consider that perhaps you may not have considered when you are, setting out on this data journey of, a very, I guess, admirable goal if you want to enable data within your organization. But we're also highlighting some of the risks and considerations about going down that journey. What we, I guess, could be talking about is this kind of the rabbit hole of this big, scary world of all of the regulations, all of the laws to consider, all of the things that could go wrong. And that is not something that we want to hold people back on their data journeys. It's something that is important to consider, to be wary of, to be mindful of, so that in setting your data strategy, that can be considered. But then how, now you have that knowledge, how do you go about, tackling that situation of managing the environment in which your data is regulated or even subject to the court of public opinion? What mechanisms can you use to help navigate that? So, there are lots of resources you can check out online. For example, privacy laws of the world. You will probably be looking at 1,000 pages just of summaries of the laws of the world. So it is not, it is not light reading. But what you can do is look to standards that exist, that either nationally or internationally recognized standards, some of which have been referenced here on screen, that if you manage to the standard, they can help direct you and help you guard against some of those risks and some of those things that you might want to protect against as you start on this journey to enable the use of data. If we could have the next slide, please. Yet another pop quiz, and you've all been very engaged so far, so thank you very much for that. If we could have the poll number 3, I believe, pop up. So this is a question of, who do you think your data strategy will apply to within your organization? A quarter of it, half of it, 3/4 of it, almost everybody, or everybody. So again, 5 options. How many people do you think that the data strategy will apply to, it will impact within your organization? If we could have the results up, please, when they're ready. Interesting. So there is no correct answer to this. It's a matter of opinion. My personal opinion, it will be somewhere between D and E. And I see that a lot of you, the majority, have said E. It applies to 100% of people in your organization. I say that because, I think that is true. You think about, even the people that you might traditionally consider to be the least involved with data. Let's say you have a building maintenance person who literally is, working with hammers and screwdrivers and drills, and they're not working with your data in your system. But do they have a roster of, who's working on what site? Do they have emergency contact details of, what other, maintenance people to call for particular electrical, fire, water, whatever it be? And then consider, is your organization's facilities of particular sensitivity? Are you dealing with victims of domestic abuse? And so your roster of what maintenance people are in what locations might be something that is, data that you actually care about. And you might say, yes, then our privacy policy applies to that. But is that enough in terms of your data strategy? Do you want to set yourself on a path where even that type of data and information, you are using your data strategy to increase the safety and security of that information? Do you want to still enable your facilities management people to understand how the building maintenance resources are being used across your locations? Just because the people doing the work are not working with the system, their work is still represented in data form. So, and I think most of you obviously recognize this with your answer, your data strategy, yes, will probably benefit your data people a lot, but it doesn't have to be exclusively for your data people. All of your people can be data people. If we could have the next slide, please, and I will hand Hippolyte over to you.
Thanks, Kevin. So now we're back to the Hollywood movie. This is the start. Teach the Children, a charity we created, fake one obviously, but the goal is to enable us to showcase some examples and to allow you to have a concrete way to refer to it and to see some things that you might not have imagined at first that were considered data or that could even be available or useful. So Teach the Children aim to provide after-class lessons to children. Where does this happen? 3 types of spaces: community centers, schools, and at home directly with the children. Who is concerned by this? 2 types of children again: children that were registered by their school through their professor, or children that were registered directly by their parent. How does the charity work? Very simply, we have volunteers that donate their time, and we have some cake sales, some baking sales to fund the overhead of the charity. So phone call, internet bill, and whatnot. What we are going to try to see what are the considerations that needs to apply to this charity and how we can try to build the start of a data strategy and what we might consider as useful information to help this charity grow. If we could have the next slide, please. So we have, of course, basic data that is being collected. We've talked about how children were registered by their professor. We need to have a registration form. This needs to be stored. We need to be able to refer to it. We have an agreement between the school, the charity, and the community center to use the different spaces to enable us to teach the lessons. We have contact details of volunteer, children's, and parent. And we even have like the budget sale, the budget data of the cake sale. All of this data, we have it, and we have it not because we tried to collect it, but because our operation demand that we have this data. So this is in a real sense, very basic information. How we collect it is another matter entirely. And a tip from us is that if you're trying to collect some data, it mostly happens at the beginning in Excel. In an ideal world, everything would be in a database straight from the start, but the real world is everything will start in Excel, probably in a drab black and white file, but having a template, a simple template, might enable you to do much more with your data and to save the data in a way that can be processed later with less lot overhead and lot less cost to you. So what is this data useful for? It's just for operation, and it's very hard for us to use it to derive any kind of meaningful insights. However, if we go to the next slide, please. We could collect more data, and sorry, I forgot to refer you to the section number 6 that will be run this week on good data quality. very important. You will be able to learn more about this subject that we can't, unfortunately, go into much detail here. But if we want to collect more data, what could we collect? Well, we could collect the grade of the children, because this is something that we are trying to improve, that we are aiming to modify. And so this is something that could produce interesting metric for us. We could take the cake sale by their location rather than just a general monthly budget data, to enable us to have more insight into where we are selling. We could try to have the attendance of the children registered, and as well as the motive of absence, to try to see if we can derive any meaning from that. We could, and we should, also observe social media. How do people interact with our charity on social media? Do we have a Facebook page? Who is tagging the subject? Who is interacting with our Facebook page? What type of photos they are posting? And then we have the inferred data that we could collect. And this is where we do the link between data that we have and data that we create. Inferred data would be, for instance, what type of people are more engaged with our charity. This could be, for instance, us trying to establish a profile of the type of children or the type of parent of children that are interacting with us. All of those data are very different. All of these pieces of data are very different from each other, and we should always be very, very mindful of what level of caution is appropriate with each type of data. For instance, the cake sale by location might appear to be more important than the rest because it deals with money. However, the simple phone number of children is actually one of the key pieces of information that we want to protect the most, for obvious reason. And this might not be obvious at first, and this is why having a policy and having a clear guideline can help you avoid trouble down the line. If we could go to the next slide, please. So, how to use the data? I said just before, we have inferred data. We want to try to use our data to do more with it and to create new data. This could be something very powerful, because, for instance, if we cross how many children register from a certain school, we can try to see if it's a demographic issue. Maybe some student population with a particular ethnic background are less likely to register, and we might want to reach out more to this population. There might also be simpler correlation to establish. For instance, if we see that the motive of absence for a certain school, for certain students in a certain school, is mostly because of transportation, then it might be very easy for us to open a second location nearer to their school to enable the lessons to be better done. All of this is obviously very much an overview of what can be done, just ideas. I will refer you to the session 3 on use case identification and session 8 descriptive analytics, which will give you a much more in-depth picture of what can be done with data and what data could be collected to improve our processes. If we could go to the next slide, please. Kevin, back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Hippolyte, for walking us through that worked example. I guess just, we'll take a minute to recap now. And why have we done that? As Hippolyte mentioned, there are a number of other talks in the series this week that he has alluded to, and there were a few others dotted throughout the earlier slides in the presentation, the links to relevant other topics that are being discussed. Your data strategy is not a thing in isolation. It is part of your data collection. What data are you going after? It is part of your visualization. How do you plan to use and display that data? It is part of your storytelling. What are you trying to actually achieve with that data to get the messages across? And hopefully what, some of that worked example does is help you think about some of those things that you need to consider as you, undertake this digital data journey. You think about enabling your organization to leverage data, and what does that mean to you? And again, just to recap, right? So we started with what is data. You need to think about this because you can't go in to this adventure with a either an assumption of what it is or it isn't, because you can end up either missing something, tripping yourself up, creating bureaucracy that you don't intend to create. So understanding and appreciating what is data is important, and that's to every bit of your organization. Again, we have to think about cultural norms as well. The building maintenance person, does that person think that they're a data person? Lawyers who work with contracts, do they think those contracts are data? So when you think about your data journey, your data culture is part of that. So again, what is data? That foundational kind of understanding is important. Then when you think about your own organizations, what data do you need? Hippolyte's worked example of what our Teach the Children charity needs versus what data do we want? You know, as we go about enablement, more becomes, you know, this drive to get more information, to get richer information, because we see the potential, we want to achieve more, we see its value. So understanding what you need versus what you want, and then how you plan to use it, is all important factors in your digital data journey. So again, we're not diving into any one of those aspects in detail. We've got other, you know, fabulous presenters who will be hopefully, you know, providing good sessions on those topics, and that you will be able to get much deeper into those individual areas, but then bring them back holistically into your data strategy. So let's bring that up to, you know, to this slide. This is something that, you know, I think is a helpful visual aid. It is applicable to finance. It's something from the World Economic Forum, and it's about the intersection of how we collect data and how we use data. And I think it's just a nice, very simple visual that kind of encapsulates some of those considerations that we've just spoken about. So bottom left quadrant is kind of the safest quadrant to be in. You're collecting the data that's being volunteered, and it is just the data that you need to do your core activity. So when you're down here, you're operating in a relatively narrow scope, but it's your safest area to operate within. Then we can go across to the right. That data that had been volunteered, we can start to make observations about it. So again, in Hippolyte's example, we start to observe patterns in that data, who's attending, who's not attending. We're getting into slightly different territory now, because that observation isn't something that's been directly supplied to us. That is something that we are seeing within the data. And then we get inference. So we've moved further now away from that safety of this is the information I gave you. And now, what are we reading? And this goes into like the storytelling. What are we reading from the information? So we've observed, you know, people provide the data of attend, not attend. We observe a pattern. Could be, you know, it's by a particular location. Do we infer something like that location is of a particular demographic? And now we're starting to say, well, actually, you know, people of this ethnicity, this race, this gender are more or less, you know, taking up this opportunity. So now we're into an inferred category, which is much less clear, much less direct compared to the volunteer data. It's powerful information. It helps our storytelling. It helps us to, you know, it helps enable us to think about what is going on in our mission, to understand it in greater detail. And we'll see more in the, you know, the AI and the data science topics around the confidence of those observations and inferences and how we can rely upon them. But we are in slightly less, you know, clear territory. And then again, as we go on the, you know, upward on the axes, we're still using that inference to conduct our core activities of our organization. So to provide that charitable, you know, service that we're offering to the children, making sure that we are giving all children equal and fair opportunity, and making sure no one's being denied. That's, you know, a pretty legitimate use of that data. But as we go upward, in this spectrum, we're doing things that are slightly less core to our mission. Improving our services, can we provide better services to the people we're targeting? It's, that's still pretty congruent with our mission's identity. So we're still relatively safe here. But as we start to go up and up, maybe we need, for instance, because of the type of organization we are, we need some help with doing some of this. And we use third parties. If those third parties are actually getting rights to use that data for their own commercial purpose, and that can happen, right? You might have someone that's helping you with analytics, and as a result of you giving them that data, they have a right in the contract to use that data for additional purposes on their end. That's a commercial agreement. It's neither right nor wrong. It just is what it is. But effectively, that data is, quote unquote, being sold to that third party. You are, to get something back from that third party, you are giving that data away to them. So now you're into a slightly different territory with that data. And again, whether you are in the left-hand side or the right-hand side of that data are all considerations. So what does this mean in terms of the data strategy setting process? As we've said before, understanding your orientation is important, because you will be somewhere in the spectrum. You will probably move around the spectrum at different times. Your data strategy is somewhat of a static guiding North Star, but it's not done once and it's forgotten. It helps you ensure, like I say, as that guiding reference point, that you are working towards that common understanding of what your objective is and what your orientation is in terms of achieving that objective. But it also needs to be somewhat flexible, so that as your data journey or your position on your data journey changes, your strategy can pivot with it. And some people talk about pivot being a negative word because it's a degree of change. I think in a strategy sense, it makes sense, because we are not going to be fundamentally U-turning our strategy. We are probably going to be pivoting our strategy to make adjustments in our course, but generally staying on one particular path. And I think what's important with that, understanding is it isn't necessarily about achieving balance in your strategy. Getting a 50-50 split on these things probably isn't, realistic or achievable. It is more about mixture rather than balance. So as you pull one particular lever to enable use of data, what levers do you need to pull to compensate for the, that's an opportunity, but it also may create risk. How do you pull the other levers to create that mixture where we have compensating factors? So an example might be you create this data so that it is enabling people in your organization to use it. The lever might not be that you provide a definitive list of every single use that's allowed. That might not be practical, but you create the data governance frameworks that enable the people in your organization who are being enabled to clear their intended uses through some governance channel. So you just offset that, that opportunity creates risk. You offset that risk by pulling some other levers within your data strategy. And I know we're coming up for time, and we want to make sure that we've got opportunity for Q&A, but if we could go quickly to the penultimate slide, to the next slide, please. Just some resources. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. It's not a definitive list. There is no, ideal blueprint for the perfect data strategy. As I say, we're all on this journey together. There are many, many resources out there. Just a couple that we're highlighting here. The Harvard Business Review is useful in talking about the offensive and defensive orientation. There's a little online utility that you can follow to come up with an assessment of what is your orientation. Also, the data ethics framework from the UK government. So this is a particular area of interest to me personally, because this is quite an evolving space. There's been a lot that's happened in the world that's got a lot of attention. We've spoken about the court of public opinion. ethics or data ethics is this space that is not about regulation, it's not about law, it's not about what you can do, it's about what you should do. It's about where you want to be as an organization and what people expect of you. There's a lot of academic work happening in this space as well. The Royal Statistical Society has got a special interest group on data ethics. There's a lot on ethics in AI. That is slightly different. You know, we all probably have heard the hypothetical scenario of self-driving cars in a road traffic accident. What decision should the car make in terms of fatalities? That's, you know, a slightly different thing to the ethics of data and use of data. So, like I say, they're one of particular interest to me personally, but, you know, there are many, many resources out there online. And if we can be of any further assistance navigating, I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to do so after the event. So if we could go to the last slide, which is nothing more than opening up the floor to questions and answers, and I will hand back to Marie.
Thank you, Kevin and Hippolyte. This is really interesting, and as you said, really an endless topic and very much an evolving one. So I see we have a couple of questions coming up. So one thing that you mentioned, you both mentioned actually at the beginning of your presentation, is the need for a universal understanding of what data is so that the right types of protocol can be applied. From your experiences, what would be the best way to ensure that within a nonprofit organization, there is basically a general understanding of the levels of risks inherent to a data strategy? Could you share more thoughts about that?
So I'll take a step first, and then Hippolyte, I'll let you comment as well. So I think some of the things that help us navigate this is, first and foremost, definitions. You know, people use the term data. Is it data with a small d, where everybody's left to interpret it, or data with a capital D, where it is a defined term and people can have this descriptive understanding, at least at the macro level, of what, you know, quote unquote data is, which could be all data, it could be strategic data, it could be structured data, unstructured data, any or all of those combinations. So, you know, your overarching, I guess, strategy should define itself within context of a definition of data that you want it to deal with. And again, there's no right or wrong. You might be prioritizing critical structured data at this point in time because that's, you know, what you can get most value out of most quickly, or you might be prioritizing unstructured data because that's where you're concerned about your emails are coming in with sensitive information and that's what you want to target. So again, you need to understand a little bit of your orientation, your landscape, but get these definitions. Then I think it's a matter of granularity. So that is the most coarse grain. What is data? Then we get slightly more fine grain, but still not fine grain, is what are certain types of data. So when we talk about certain classes of data within our organization, are we all using the same vocabulary? So to have a taxonomy, a vocabulary of data, that if we talk about communication data, what does that really mean? Is it the email, or it is also the phone call? It's also the notes you take about your phone call. Have that vocabulary so that everybody can look at it and go, what am I dealing with here? I'm dealing with a certain class of data that I understand in natural language terms, not complicated IT technical terms, not database schema. This is just, what is this type of data that I'm dealing with? And then you get your classifications. So again, if you can create as part of your strategy a data classification framework that says this type of data belongs to this particular level. And again, there might be something, this is public data, this is just internal for our organization, this is confidential, this is highly confidential, it's personal information, it's you know, the specialist category of personal information. These things help you get that kind of level ground, that baseline of what your organization is dealing with in terms of its data. When you're handling data, you know where it is and how it applies to your data strategy. I don't know if that's addressed the question, but Hippolyte, I'll let you add anything further.
Thank you, Kevin. I completely agree with what you just said. One further thing I just want to point out is that having one person or one department, depending on the size of your organization, that people know they can reach out and that those people will be able to answer any question or to be able to fetch the answer to this question can be very, very beneficial, because then if you have a single doubt, just with an email or a phone call, you can have the answer to your question, because sometimes the documentation that you leave, and I encourage you to leave documentation for people who are in your organization, but maybe the use case isn't clear, maybe the way it's written won't be clear to the person reading it, and having a point of contact is, I think, one of the key steps, because one person can dedicate themselves to understanding very deeply the subject, but in a way that we can't ask everyone to really delve into the legalese and into all the implication that it has.
And to your point, Hippolyte, on having actually someone available to answer any questions and overcome any issues, can you perhaps tell us a bit more on how a good company data culture can help anchor a cohesive data strategy and perhaps to some extent eliminate some of the risk related to breaches or any others we can think of?
Sure. So hopefully my answers won't annoy the legal team too much, but here at Bloomberg, we do have a very comprehensive culture of data security, and that allow us to really have a good idea of what we're dealing with and what type of data we can share, what type of data we cannot share. And those policies are very clear. As Kevin said, they are extremely clear, extremely well written. And at the same time, we know that there is more data available if the overview isn't enough. And so to avoid this risk, having these policies allow you to really ask yourself the question. And I think this is perhaps the most important thing, is to make people aware that there is a question to be asked. Because if people don't think about it, then there is no chance at all that they will take the proper step to prevent any kind of data breaches. However, if you raise the question, if you sensitize people in your organization regularly with maybe an email or a seminar, maybe this conference talk that will be registered and available online, then it might be a good way for people to be sensitized to the subject and prevent any data breach, because they will simply ask themselves, oh, should I share this Excel file with the whole organization, or should I really just share it with one person? This is the kind of question that is maybe innocuous, but if what data is in the Excel file is maybe personal information, even though the data you wanted to share that also happen to be in the same Excel file isn't personal. And so those type of talk, those type of action that sensitivize people to the subject might help you prevent incident on the line. Kevin, you probably have more to say about the subject.
I mean, I would just add that the data culture is something that is being constantly developed, and I don't think whether it's an organization like ours that you look at the big tall buildings and everything looks great and shiny and glossy, that everybody has the data culture to exactly the same level. So I think it's a matter of reiteration and engagement. The example that I used in this session that I use regularly is the translation website, because it is so innocuous. It is part of what many people now have never lived in a world without a free online translator. The people don't appreciate that there's a data, there are data companies behind these things. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. But it's that understanding, that's the data culture. It's things like that. How can you engage with your audience to make them, particularly if they're not traditionally data people? We've given some examples like the building maintenance person or the lawyers working in Word documents. How do we create that engagement that resonates? So I think that has a real impact, because then people start to come forward and go, hey, I didn't think about it. And if your data strategy has structures, as Hippolytus mentioned, people they can go to, or forums that they can clear things through, then you have an engagement model and a funnel point, and you can catch stuff before it's too late, because that email that went through that translation website technically could be an incident, a breach. That's data that may have gone outside of your protection and security that you would not have wanted to. So the more people think about it up front, the better your culture is. You can't technologically guard against everything, but you create that, that conduct culture where people are mindful of data in their day-to-day lives.
And stepping away a bit from sort of data privacy or data standards, how we have a question around another aspect of data strategy and how you can actually include change management as part of a successful data strategy. So I will leave it to either you, Kevin, or Hippolyte to start.
Hippolyte, would you like to go first on this one?
I am happy for you to go first, but
okay, cool. So I guess without being able to go back and forth with the question asker, I'm not sure of the context. So there's change management in terms of helping to understand the impact to data, or change for the good of enabling data. I think both are sort of relevant. So technology modernization programs, for instance, should be considerate of as you're assessing your technologies, you're making your change decisions around your data agenda. So this gets slightly more into the technical side of things, and there may be sessions around this, but your change management can be such that you're making change, again, progressively to comply with architecture requirements. So, do you have a logical data model requirement? And I know we haven't got, deep into what data models are, and there might be a bit of a technical term, but you can bake these things into your change management process so that as you modernize, as you evolve, you are building for data. So that again, when we talk about, you're building a new system, you're going through the database change, all of your fields that you've got that contain data, how do you get them into your catalog so that you know what you're housing? Do you build lineage into your change management process? So I'm developing a new handoff from point A to point B. Do I log that lineage? Do I have a requirement through that change to have a quality contract? Again, I'm handing off from A to B. What does B need from A? What's the mechanism that we feed back if what B gets is not meeting the expectation of what it requires of A? So we can build these things both as sort of controls into the change management process and proactively that we are prioritizing change based on its impact to data. Will this be a change that makes the data more accessible? Does it get it off of spreadsheets on different laptops, which are hard to work with, into a consolidated database that is more usable? That can be part of your assessment in terms of what change should I work on. If that has a benefit to the data strategy, that can be part of the consideration.
Yeah, if I might just add something, if we still have a lot of time. I see it's 4 p.m. So
go ahead.
So I totally agree with what Kevin said. And furthermore, what might help is to explain to people the benefit, because oftentimes when you are doing a change, any type of change actually, but in data especially, you are going to impact people, you are going to impact the way they work, the way they used to operate. And sometimes you are going to disrupt processes that have been in place for years or even decades. And so it's much more smooth if you manage to tell people, well, this is the benefit that you are going to have from going through that change. And this is something that I've experienced. If you try to force it on people, if you try to say this is regulation, it might not come as smoothly and as easily as if you said, well, having this system in place, having those checks in place will allow us to be mindful of the regulation and to prevent any kind of risk of data, or to really minimize the risk of data leak that we might incur. This is, I think, for the human aspect, because Kevin covered the technical aspect extremely well. Informing people and being available to answer questions or to research more answer, because you might not have all the answers available, is also a key point.
Thank you, Hippolyte. So I think, unfortunately, we're running out of time, and I know we didn't have time to go through all the questions, but we will make sure to answer any of those questions later down the line over email. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. Next session will be held tomorrow at 9:30 BST, and we will discuss data use case identification. So if you haven't signed up yet, it's still time to do so on our event site. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Hippolyte. And we hope to see you tomorrow.